Omo Agege, Delta Central Senatorial District. Mr. President, I rise to lead the debate for a second reading of a bill for an act for the prevention, prohibition, and redressal of sexual harassment of students in tertiary educational institutions and for matters connected therewith. Mr. President, let me state ab initio that I have the presumptive and the constructive consent of all of the senators in the Ninth Senate. Mr. President, my colleagues, as our nation's foremost legislative body, this Senate has a unique constitutional obligation to protect our citizens and shared values. Therefore, Mr. President, confident of your firm support, I stand here today on behalf of all victims of sexual harassment in our tertiary academic institutions, to move this all-important motion for the second reading of this bill. Mr. President, I must first thank the co-sponsors and supporters of this bill for their leadership conviction on the challenge of sexual harassment in our tertiary academic institutions. Thank you indeed, distinguished colleagues. It is pertinent to note it's united against sexual harassment epidemic in our academic institutions, viewing same as a serious challenge to our fundamental values.
Order.
I remain grateful to all of our colleagues then and all of our colleagues now who were part of the exemplary spirit of unity of purpose, patriotism, and service. May I declare again, Mr. President, as I did in 2016, that I address this Senate not just as a lawmaker, but also as a parent. Like a vast majority of our citizens and non-citizens, we all have or pray to have our children, wards, or relatives attend tertiary institutions for academic development. Therefore, this bill is for every family in this country. Mr. President, sexual harassment in our campuses is a repugnant challenge to our values as a people. For far too long, sexual predators masquerading as educators have plied the corridors of our nation's higher institutions unchecked. It will continue in the absence of appropriate leadership response. Mr. President, by this bill, this Ninth Senate is sending a very strong message that we refuse to put our students at the mercy of any sexual predator. Mr. President, Nigerian students, parents, civil society organizations, and our government want us to strengthen our laws against sexual harassment and mandate the management of tertiary academic institutions to act with strong statute. They want us, Mr. President, to stop the insulting and simplistic leniency of suspending or terminating the appointments of sexual predators without more. Indeed, Mr. President, it is most offensive to suggest that mere suspension or termination of appointments is the appropriate remedy for the offense of sexually harassing another person. This bill, Mr. President, is an assurance to all that this Senate believes that when we send our children, especially our daughters, nieces, and wives to schools, our educators will statutorily be their mentors, motivators, and guardians. Mr. President, the teacher's role in society's quest for greatness is so fundamental that the student-educator relationship is in that unique class of parenting. It is a fiduciary relationship of authority, dependency, and trust, where the educator, like a good parent, exercises supervisory responsibilities over the student. It mirrors the legal doctrine of loco parentis, which places protective parent-like responsibilities on educators and students. The student-educator relationship is formed on a code of absolute honor and obligation of good faith, honesty and dignity, and care to be held inviolable. An educator with predatory sexual desires is unfit for local parentis duties. An educator with uncontrollable sexual desires should not be allowed to exercise fiduciary duty, particularly in the student-educator relationship, because of the enormous power they wield over our students. Mr. President, just recently, the BBC reawakened our consciousness to this shame in our society. A supposed pastor and a sub-dean in the prestigious University of Lagos was allegedly, that's the word, allegedly caught shamelessly abusing his office for sexual gains. But because that is not who we are, many Nigerians, including His Excellency President Muhammadu Buhari and our First Lady, Her Excellency Mrs. Aisha Buhari, have been speaking against it, as it should be. Unfortunately, that is the only option available to many out there who are powerless. Just condemn the scourge of sexual predation. The duty to take firm and lasting action lies here on the floor of these red chambers and, of course, the green chamber. Fairly long ago, Mr. President, precisely on November 27, 1988, the Sunday Tribune, in an editorial stated, thus, sexual harassment is rampant in all Nigerian institutions of higher learning. In some places, it has almost become an accepted fact that the female student must submit. End of quote. In 2013, the National Universities Commission, NUC, agreed that over 50 corruptions perpetrated in our universities, sexual harassment seemed to rank extremely very high among corrupt practices uncovered in our universities. End of quote. Mr. President, in 2014, the International Journal of Applied Psychology noted, and I quote, in Nigeria, sex for grades in the tertiary institutions is a reality, and the male lecturers in particular perceive themselves as teen gods, and such unprofessional behavior can be perpetuated unchecked. End of quote. The well-respected poet, who happens to be my brother, Dr. Ogaga Ifowodo, also once noted, and I quote, our campuses of supposed higher learning are more or less veritable sexual jungles, where academic staff especially, but also senior administrative staff, are prowling predators. Sex for marks or other favors has become so entrenched as to have acquired the status of a law of nature. Put bluntly, it is as if our university, polytechnics and colleges of education campuses are sex colonies, where rape or other forms of coerced copulation and intimacy may be practiced without sanctions. End of quote. Clearly, Mr. President, this is an extraordinary mischief. Our people are disgusted by the observed subculture of sex for grades or other favors in our tertiary institutions, because nothing has been done to arrest it as expected in a civilized society. The chain of victims is growing daily. Mr. President, had we acted earlier, many respected women seated in their homes or watching us right now online or live TV would have avoided the trauma of sexual harassment that still torments them till date. Some would not have spent more years in school just because they dared to stand their ground against vicious and wicked sexual predators in many of our universities. Mr. President, had we acted much earlier, Ms. Shola, a brilliant student of the University of Ibadan, as reported by Vanguard, may not have scored 40 marks instead of 60 that she believed she deserved. Her offense was being bold enough to reject amoral advances of a lecturer. That's why she got only 40 instead of 60. Mr. President, had we acted much earlier, Hamza Kota would not have spent extra years in the University of Abuja. So too is Ms. Chinelo Emenike of the Imo State University, as reported by Premier Times, whose head of department failed to act to protect her even when she reported her ordeal in the hands of her lecturer. Mr. President, the victims' ordeal are too many and repulsive to recount. So I'm going to quote a writer, and I quote, the ungovernable libido of lecturers has led to some harried female students resorting to desperate means of looking sexually unappealing or putting themselves within the assumed safe bounds of moral and social norms, such as wearing wedding bands even though they are married, strapping cushions to their bellies to feign pregnancy, forgoing a bath, dressing down and shunning makeup before office visits, pleading the monthly visitation, etc., all to no avail. Always the sex-obsessed lecturer wielding his illegitimate power ask dryly, do you want to pass this course to graduate or not? End of quote. Mr. President, this is so repugnant. Yet there are no clear sanctions against the serious crime. Instead, all we hear is the lecturer has been suspended or the lecturer has been sacked, as if these are commensurate sanctions for a crime that the entire world views with extreme outrage. In this wise, Dr. Adekunle Idris, the former ASU chairman in the Lagos State University, once noted, and I quote, "The truth of the matter for now, the truth of the matter is for now, we don't have specific guidance in respect of sanctions. What we are doing is to continually sensitize our members in terms of seminars, in terms of talking to one another during our congresses, to ensure that best practices are always adhered to during all of our activities. It is only a matter of moral suasion that we're having for now." End of quote in Premium Times. This is an ASU chairman. Mr. President, I humbly submit that a mischief of this consciencelessness is not one to ignore or feign indifference over. It is our duty to protect our people with the fullness of our parliamentary authority and good conscience. Mr. President, the brazen sexual predation being unleashed on our students is a very serious crime. We cannot leave it to suasion, our seminars and conferences. This bill, Mr. President, will replace that suasion with a tough law that raises the bar of ethical conduct and discipline in our learning environment. Mr. President, the strongest and the most effective way to deal with the offense of sexual harassment in our tertiary institutions is to penalize the very impropriety of the act, with or without consent, by making consent immaterial once the act itself is established. In other words, we seek to elevate the offense of sexual harassment in our tertiary education institutions to statutory rape with strict liability. This will make it easier to prosecute offenders. Under the criminal and penal codes, a victim's informed and voluntary consent is a defense. Under the criminal and penal codes, the extant criminal and penal codes today, a victim's informed and voluntary consent is a defense to a charge of rape. But consent is no defense where the victim is a minor. This is statutory rape for which strict liability attaches. The very act, that's the actus reus itself, proves the crime. Herein lies the distinctness of this bill. Just like a minor in both the criminal and penal codes, a student is vulnerable in the student-educator relationship of authority, dependency, and trust. If a predator staff of a tertiary education institution exploits this vulnerability to sexual advantage, that reprehensible act itself must be penalized with or without consent, as there cannot be informed and voluntary consent by a student held hostage by the official authority of an educator. This is the strongest and the most effective way to reduce the troubling challenge of sexual harassment in our tertiary institutions. By removing the defense of consent between a student and an educator as a defense, this bill, when enacted into law, as I said, will elevate sexual harassment in our tertiary institutions to the status of statutory rape or strict liability offense. This will offer better protection to our students in the unique student-educator relationship and makes it less difficult to prosecute sexual predators. It's been suggested, Mr. President, by a few, that somehow this bill unduly targets a segment of the society and therefore is discriminatory. Without question, this is right and unapologetically so. That argument, Mr. President, is unsupported by our jurisprudence of criminal law, which is the targeting of an identified class of offenders for sanctioning, correction, and deterrence. The bad eggs in the identified class tormenting the life of our female students may have thought that we would turn a blind eye to their iniquities, to be intimidated. But we are now proving them wrong by this bill. One, that the President Muhammadu Buhari has publicly indicated his interest to give assent to this bill when passed by the National Assembly. This bill, Mr. President, has 27 clauses. Clause 1 is on the objective of the bill. Clauses 2 and 3 are the relationship of authority, dependency, and trust between an educator and a student. Offenses constitute sexual harassment under the bill are articulated in Clause 4. Marriage is a defense under Clause 5. Marriage is a defense under Clause 5. Under Clause 6, it is not a defense that the student consented to any offense in Clause 4. Clauses 8 to 10, 11 to 12, and 13 and 14 are respectively on commencement of criminal proceedings, penalty, and civil action for the educator's breach of fiduciary duty. Clauses 15, 16, and 17 are on institutional disciplinary measures, independent sexual harassment prohibition committee, and institutional disciplinary procedure respectively, thus providing a uniform statutory framework for all institutions to follow on sexual harassment. Clause 18 is on judicial review of decisions taken by an institution. Clauses 19 and 20 spell out the criminal liability of administrative heads as defined under the bill, where there is failure to address sexual harassment complaints as contemplated under this bill. Clauses 21, 22, and 28 are concerned with liability on a student for false complaint. Clauses 23 to 25 make provisions for the protection of students from victimization under any guise. Clauses 26 and 27 are on definition of terms and citation respectively. Mr. President, some advocates have suggested the extension of this bill. Indeed, this has been the problem we've had. Some have suggested the extension of this bill to cover primary and secondary schools. Mr. President, strict penal liability already attaches to sexual harassment of minors in primary and secondary schools in our extant laws. It is equally not necessary, Mr. President, to extend this bill to cover similar fiduciary relationships, especially priest-congregant, employer-employee, father-daughter, warder-prisoner, because the criminal and penal codes already adequately deals with these categories with sufficient clarity. On suggestions of inadequate sanctions for students who falsely accuse educators of sexual harassment, the reality, Mr. President, that this bill prescribes expulsion for those students. In addition, an educator whose character is maligned is at liberty to sue for defamation under the extant defamation laws, which is well settled in our jurisprudence, and that needs no duplication in this bill. Mr. President, it has also been suggested that this bill may abridge the right to private and family life, and that's a fundamental right. The right to private and family life as enshrined in Section 37 of the 1999 Constitution as amended. Mr. President, this is not correct, because Section 45, subsection 1 of the Constitution expressly states that, 1, nothing in Section 37, 38, 39, and 40 of this Constitution shall invalidate any law that is reasonably justifiable in a democratic society. Subparagraph B, for the purpose of protecting the rights and freedom of other persons. For the purpose of protecting the rights and freedom of other persons. This bill therefore stands on a solid constitutional wicket to cure the mischief of sexual harassment of students in our tertiary institutions. Mr. President, there's also the suggestion that some students, especially females, harass educators by their mode of dressing, and that this bill may not have done enough to protect educators. I understand this concern, Mr. President. However, the educator can activate institutional disciplinary actions against such students. What is more, a student pays a price for saying no to a predator's demand for sexual favors, whereas the reverse is the case if a student were to harass an educator. The educator pays no price for saying no to that student. Our students are the real victims here, and we must so recognize they need our protection. The reality is that in other jurisdictions where students dress more indecently and indeed more provocatively, laws exist to forbid student-educator relationships. The students are not sexually harassed as it is here. In America, under the Honor Code, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act 1964 and Title IX of the Higher Education Amendments Act 1972, the university system is against sexual harassment of students by faculty members. As a signpost, Harvard University declares, and I quote, "No faculty member, instructor, teaching assistant, teaching fellow, researcher, tutor, graduate student, or undergraduate course assistant shall request or accept sexual favors from or initiate or engage in a romantic or sexual relationship with any student, including a graduate student. For Yale University, Mr. President, sexual harassment is an affront to human dignity and fundamentally at odds with the values of Yale University. Sexual harassment is a violation of federal and state laws. In the UK, Mr. President, the almost 609-year-old St. Andrews University in Scotland affirms that there is, quote, danger that such relationships exploit the relationship of authority and trust that is inherent in the relationship between members of staff and students, end of quote. In Australia, Queensland, the law forbids the student-educator sexual relationship. In South Africa, under Section 17 of the Employment of Educators Act 1998, as amended, it is an offense for an educator to have a sexual relationship with a student. Mr. President, my colleagues, this bill is for our students, especially our daughters and our wives, who deserve tertiary learning environments devoid of sexual harassment. Even leading academics agree with us that this bill is a necessity. In the words of President Dickinson College, in the words of the president of Dickinson College, and the former president of American University of Nigeria in Adamawa here, not too long ago, Dr. Maji Ensing, I quote her, "I am glad that this is finally happening in Nigeria, that's this bill, and I can't imagine anyone will be opposed to this legislation. I think it is a defining moment for Nigerians, and I am proud of the many senators who co-sponsor the new legislation. I call on all vice chancellors to join us at the American University of Nigeria and lobby for the passage of this bill." End of quote. Premium Times. May Ensing's voice of reason remind us that the history of this Ninth Senate will endure in human conscience as we pass this bill into law for all families and true believers in the nobility of the teaching profession. Mr. President, in compliance with Order 77.3 of the Standing Rules, I state that this bill has no financial implications. Accordingly, there is no accompanying financial compendium. For the greater good of our Republic, I hereby humbly move for a second reading of this bill to be taken. I so move and yield the floor, Mr. President. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Uche Lilian Ekwunife.
The Deputy Senate President for bringing this very important bill before us this afternoon. Mr. President, you recall that I sent similar bill to you, which is still in the pipeline, which means there must be harmonization of this bill. This bill is apt and is auspicious in the sense that this is daily occurrence in Nigeria, to the extent that international community is not paying attention to sexual harassment that happens every day in our life. Mr. President, this submission is quite, this submission is quite explosive, and the content of this submission is quite clear, and this is a straightforward bill. But having said that, Mr. President, I believe that his last submission, that criminal code and the penal codes have taken care of other sexual harassments in the private sector, in the churches and all that. No, Mr. President, I don't agree to that, because criminal codes and penal codes don't have stringent and strict punishment for offenders. I think we need to harmonize the earlier act on this with this present bill we are about to enact. Mr. President, what happens to women is not something we sit on this floor to talk about. It doesn't just happen only in the tertiary institutions. It happens everywhere. House girls have not even come out to talk about what they see in the hands of their masters. How about the banks? How about corporate entities? It happens everywhere. It's not just in the universities. Mr. President, I can see where some people are making arguments that some women lure men, they seduce men because of the way they dress. It doesn't really matter to anybody how someone decides to dress. It's not enough for the person to go through sexual harassment. Mr. President, the law should cover all manner of sexual harassment, whether it is in the tertiary institution or in the private sector, or in the mosque, or in the church, I think we have to address it holistically, because women are suffering so much in the hands of the men. And I haven't seen any man that has come out one day to say that a woman sexually harassed him. I haven't seen many men that can say that. It happens where? I haven't seen any man that said that. So, Mr. President, I support this bill holistically, but I feel that this should be expanded to what is happening in the private sector, what is happening in the churches, what is happening in the mosque, what is happening everywhere, even what is happening domestically. Some men will bring in house girls in the name of, serving them domestically, but they end up converting them to sex machine. And I know that men in these chambers understand what I'm talking about. Mr. President, even in political, some men also exchange.
I don't think so. There is no there is no male senator here who understands what you are talking about in that respect. Okay, go on.
Mr. President, thank you very much. I'm not saying that doing that, but what I'm trying to say is that we don't need to limit it to tertiary institutions alone. It happens in our homes. It happens in markets. It happens. Some businessmen also convert their sales girls to sex machines. We need to put stringent and very strict punishment for offenders. It's not just mentioning it here. I even suggest that 21 years imprisonment is not enough for this kind of, destruction of our young girls and turning our young girls into sexual machines. So while I support this bill, I want to plead that we go back to criminal and penal code act to amend it to holistically put it together to be a one document.
You can round up now.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Betty Apiafi.
I represent Rivers West Central District. I'm from Rivers State. Mr. President, I'd like to first of all thank the Deputy Senate President for leading this all-important bill. This issue has been going on in our nation and in other countries as well for a long time, and we'd like to commend the male champion who has decided to stand and work with the women to make sure that this issue is properly addressed. Mr. President, just like the mover of the bill said, the relationship between a student and a teacher or an educator is formed on a code of absolute honor, an obligation and good faith, honesty and dignity. It's so important to know that this is the relationship that is supposed to be, what the relationship is supposed to be based on. And when that trust is destroyed, it is difficult to build it back in the life of the victim. This unique relationship is like a relationship of a mentor and a mentee. And when a teacher is a mentor and you're supposed to be mentoring a young child, and you take absolute advantage because you have authority, it's an unforgivable thing to do. And not only to teachers, really, even in the place of work. It is absolutely unforgivable because you have the power of authority and you can use that authority to take undue advantage of the people you are supposed to be mentoring. Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, one painful thing about the victims of sexual harassment is they go through life with a scar that can never be removed. And I don't see how the victim is going through life with that kind of scar and the predator is going away scot-free. Like the mover of the bill has said, suspending or expelling lecturers or the predators is not enough. We have to tighten up this bill and make sure that sanctions are such that will be a deterrent rather than, if you suspend a lecturer today, he goes somewhere else to look for a job. He can even leave the country and go ahead and look for another job. Mr. President, the bill, to me, should be extended to our primary and secondary schools. The reason why, though the mover of the bill has said the issues of primary and secondary school have been addressed, but you see, it's more important that we protect our minors. Today we need to have a register of offenders. We have pedophiles all over the place. But as a nation, we don't even have a list of these offenders. They walk from one education institution and move on to another education institution in another state and work. So by taking like Honorable Distinguished Senator Uche said, by taking a holistic view of sexual offenders, we should be able to situate the sexual offenders register in a particular institution, so that people can access the sexual offenders register and know exactly who they are recruiting. If you want to make a recruitment, you must have clearance of the from this sexual offenders register before you can recruit anybody in any education institution. So by the time we take this bill to public hearing, as the chair Women Affairs and representing the women, we are going to make a strong case for the inclusion of primary and secondary schools, and of course where we should situate the register for sexual offenders, so that people cannot do these things and get away with it. So if you are a sexual offender, you are known as a sexual offender. If we are going to be naming and shaming them every now and again, fine. If we have to, but I mean, whatever it is, you will know that it's not only the punishment or the jail term you get for being a sexual offender, but that your name is retained in the memory of this nation, so that people will take this issue more seriously. Mr. Distinguished colleagues and Mr. President, you're very distracted.
I'm with you, Distinguished Senator Piafi.
And commend once again the Deputy Senate President for bringing up this all-important bill at this very critical time. I so support.
Thank you very much, Senator Ahmed Babakar.
We know that the occurrence and the names and the instances that he has cited, they are true and they are to support, this bill. But I think as a parliament, what should be our concern now is one, how to protect the victims. The legislation must have provision for protection of the victims. And then two, the legislation must provide serious sanctions or punishment for perpetrators. Well, for the protection of victims like Hamzat, like Chinelo, like Shola mentioned, these are people who, or no accord of theirs, over the overbearing tendencies of social perverts, rapists, and then of course the educators that are asking, for sex, for marks. I want to say, Mr. President, that everywhere in Nigeria today, the direction is not the teacher-student or the male teacher and the female student alone. On campuses today, you see that male students, cultists, equally harass and rape female students. I think this legislation must equally take care of that. A lot of girls have had to flee campuses, hostels, both on campus and off campus, because of cultists who want to force them, against their will. And then these cultists too, amongst lecturers, equally want to force the male and the female students. So, to a very small extent, even female students harass male students.
Hey.
This.
Distinguished Senator Orogire. Okay, continue.
I'm just saying the truth, because sexual harassment is not unidirectional. It goes both ways.
It's not true.
What is ugly is ugly. It doesn't matter if the occurrence is very minimal, but we know that the overbearing, demographic or statistics is issue of teachers, male teachers against female students. That, of course, is completely unacceptable. So we are supporting this bill. I'm supporting this bill because there must be very serious consequences. that must be visited on perpetrators of these ugly acts. Mr. President, a lot of us went to school, and I'm glad too that my sisters or our daughters went to school, in this country, and both of them, they have this ugly story to tell. We must get to a point where this thing really must be checked. In contemporary Nigeria, if of course we have problems with governance, and we are leaving our institutions where people are supposed to learn the basic things, and at that point they are corrupted, then in which case we will have no future. So I want to urge the Senate that this bill, we must look at it very seriously, so that the provisions must serve as a deterrent to any person that probably want to perpetrate this act. Thank you very much.
Senator Akoniya, representing the good people of Akwa Ibom South Senatorial District. I want to join other distinguished senators to appreciate a great man, the Deputy Senate President, for undertaking the sponsorship of this bill, co-sponsored by almost all the senators in the House. Mr. President, teachers are the second parents of any child. The first parents are the biological parents. As they step out of the home and into the school, teachers are supposed to take absolute care of the children, from the nursery to primary to secondary to university. But unfortunately, as clearly stated in this proposal, this happens from the nursery. You have matured children in the primary sector of the nursery school, and then the secondary school and the tertiary institution as stated. The bill has also clearly stated where these ugly incidences occur. At home, master and the house helps, a lot of things happen. Some, they don't bring it to the public. In the church, thank God for the few that have been exposed. Others are there hiding under the coverage of the church leadership. I want to support very, very strongly that this bill should be accepted, should be approved by the senators here, by the chambers, and that it should move to the public hearing and be passed into the act. I stand to support it clearly, sir. Let's all join hands. Thank you.
I'll put the question now. Those against say nay, the ayes have it. Flag of the Senate. Of students in tertiary education institutions for other matters connected there with 2019 second reading, and is hereby referred to the Senate Committee on Judiciary, Human Rights and Legal Matters, and to report back in 2 weeks. Distinguished colleagues, thank you very much for the various contributions and interventions on the debate. This is one bill that has a very universal acceptance, not only to the legislators, but every Nigerian parent, husband, brother, name it, would like to see an environment where our females are fully protected, fully hopeful that nothing, no harm will come their way, whether they are in educational institutions or anywhere else. The recent events in some of our institutions was a disgrace. And just like the Deputy President of the Senate said in his contribution, that is not who we are. We are cultured people. We are people that know that this country, we as a nation, we as communities, will always protect our female, regardless of their age and, of course, status. I agree with Senator Uche Lilian Ekwenefe, when she said, what we are talking about has gone beyond the four walls of tertiary institutions or universities. It happens everywhere. And of course, it is important that we look into what she was suggesting. Having taken this bill this far, how can we ensure that bankers, the female bankers, do not go through the kind of indecent requests, or maybe some kind of unnecessary assault on their lives by people who are at the top of their management, or whoever is boss. There are so many things happening around. So we should be looking at other ways of ensuring that all our females are protected. For this, I want to congratulate the Deputy President of Senate and all the co-sponsors, even though I could see that I was excluded, but I've also put my name. Leader of the Senate.